Well, hey there, everyone. Welcome back into another episode of the Winsome Creationist, here with our friend, Dr. Phil Dennis again. Phil, how are you doing this morning, sir?
I'm doing great, Stephen. How are you doing?
Man, I am doing good. We spent the last little bit working through some technical issues to try to give the best presentation possible for everyone here. So hopefully that will work out, and Lord willing, all the tech will cooperate. Real quick disclaimer on this one. If you are listening on audio on the podcast, probably going to be another one that you might want to zoom over to YouTube for. These tend to be presentation heavy, and we're going to have a lot of stuff on the screen for you to see. So if you're listening on audio, make the move over to YouTube, and I think you'll have a little better experience, but we'll do our best to make it friendly for those who want to continue listening on audio as well. All right, so the subject matter today is a deep one, and it's also a wide one. We could probably spend 5 or 6 hours talking about it, but we're going to try to condense this into as close to an hour or so as we possibly can. We're talking about the subject of presentism versus eternalism. And we're going to define those terms really quick. This has come up a few times in the series that we've done looking at the Starlight issue from a creationist perspective. And this is just one of those things, Phil, that, it looks like creationists are, the word I want to use is confused. I think there's a lot of creationists and frankly, a lot of Christians actually confused about this. And as we're going to talk about way later, that's even evident in some of the shows and movies and things that get produced, and the attractions even that, we use for entertainment. And so we're going to try to demystify this and make it friendly for you, discussing presentism versus eternalism. Any preliminary comments before we dive in?
Yes, I think the one of the main points is that the notion of eternalism became very popular, or came into the mainstream with the advent of the special theory of relativity. The whole issue is that they said that you cannot determine which two events are simultaneous, and we will get into some of the philosophical arguments that are used to support that the future and the past and the present are all coexist, that they have to, that somehow that's necessitated by the theory of special relativity.
Right.
And then, of course, that bleeds into our culture and our science thinking and science fiction and so forth. So,
yeah,
I guess that's the main thing. So its advent was enhanced by the special theory of relativity. Prior to that, the view was you had the Newtonian classical view of time, that it was unalterable, absolute. Everybody agreed or could agree on the present, that there was a time and that was the present, and that the past no longer existed and the future is yet to be. So,
yeah. Yeah, and that idea of time travel, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. That's man, I mean, people love time travel. I mean, I love time travel. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and there's nothing more exciting for a Star Trek fan than watching the crew of the Enterprise get caught in a temporal loop where they relive the same moment over, the same 3 hours over and over again. And the reality is that that may or may not actually be something that maps to reality. And if it was just a case of fiction versus nonfiction, that's one thing. But we're talking about something where the fiction is deemed to very much be the reality, and that's where we may have a problem. So,
right.
Before we get too lost, we should dive into defining our terms pretty quickly here.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Briefly, presentism is the notion or the philosophical view that reality is a three-dimensional space. We live in 3D, the standard way we think of, you can move forward and backwards, left and right, and up and down. Those are the three, roughly directions that you can move, and that you persist through time. In other words, your individual identity persists through time, but you don't have some part of you that's still in the past or some part of you that's, quote, already in the future. And all we have to do is juxtapose to that the eternalist point of view. Like I said, the future is already there, the past is still there, and you're in the now. So you're 4D. And the eternalist point of view, like I said, the future is already there, the past is still there, and you're in the now. So you're 4D. And the And the world is a four-dimensional block, is the notion of eternalism. If I may jump ahead a bit, there's another middle ground, or some people think, called the growing block universe, which has, you could have a temporal past, and the present moves forward in time. The future doesn't exist, but the past will always exist. In other words, once something has happened, it's still there. So you can see that that's a form of eternalism. And we'll talk about that a little bit briefly later, but the two main schools are presentism and eternalism. Those two views basically encapsulate aspects of the tension between the two philosophies of time.
Right. Yes. And related to this, just for you philosophy nerds, we are not going to dive into this rabbit hole very far at all. But related to this is the notion between what they call the A theory and the B theory of time. And again, those actual theories have a lot to do with, say, like, the idea of tensed verbs, right? Are tensed verbs, nonsensical? Are they even possible? And the reality is that presentism versus eternalism is just more concerned with, I don't know, Phil, if the right way to say it is the ontology, but it's just more concerned with what is now, even, right? Are there like infinite numbers of nows where, there is a now where the me of an hour ago, was back there? Or, it's even hard to work on the language. Or is the me of an hour ago gone forever? In other words, non existent. And the only me that exists is the one that is currently talking to you right now. These are the kind of questions that we want to answer when we talk about presentism and eternalism. And so we're going to talk about it from a few different angles. If we were to provide like I don't know, sort of a summary as to the why, maybe a sort of clickbait sort of title as to the why this really matters, I might say something like why all Christians should be presentists, or why no Christian should be an eternalist, right? Something like that, because really what we have is a number of scientific considerations, theological and philosophical problems and considerations, and then also some practical things to talk about as well. All right. So to this point, presentism, basically you and me, we are 3D objects persisting through time. And then on eternalism, we are 4D objects essentially extended in this block universe, extended in time, but really nothing is actually happening. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, that's correct. So ontology is the philosophy of what exists. And for the eternalists, what exists is this 4D block universe, that it just is. And for a presentist, what exists is just a 3D space that we move in, and time passes. And we'll get into the issue of souls. What makes an identity, what a person is, personhood is our soul's spirits, right? We have a material body, but have a soul yesterday and a soul tomorrow and a soul today, if you follow what I'm saying. I mean, we always have our current soul. Okay.
Yep, exactly right. And we're going to tease that right now and make you wait a little bit before we get into it, because it'll be, I think it's going to be really fascinating. So why don't we dive right into kind of the science side of things? Because to set this up a little bit, one of the things that made this come up originally is, we were going through Jason Lyle's anisotropic synchrony convention. And one of the things that he says in his Einstein's book is he's got this quote that suggests that time travel is possible. And that led to a little bit of confusion, because there are notions of his anisotropic synchrony convention and then also Tycho Tenev's creation time coordinate solution, which is loosely based on the ASC. There are notions that kind of dip in and out. It's like they might affirm presentism on one angle, but then eternalism on another angle. And so that's actually, this episode is really part of that overall detangling of things. We really need to separate these two out. And so any general thoughts are welcome as we dive into that. But the first scientific consideration on my list is just why we need to understand that actually the mathematics are neutral with respect to both presentism and eternalism.
Okay. Let's see. I was going to do this summary slide here on certain aspects of eternalism, and I don't need to go through it point by point. But yeah, I've culled some of these slides out of prior presentations, and I'll just put them up and comment on them.
Yeah, this is helpful.
This slide shows what even the secularists will describe when they're describing eternalism. They'll say the universe is like a film strip, right? So if you have a film, all the cells of the film exist in that can, right? So the beginning of the movie exists, the middle of the movie, and if you got an infinite movie that keeps on going on forever, then you got cells going into the future. But you can't change the film, right? So the film strip corresponds to the block universe, okay? And that's, I guess that's pretty much what I want to say. So as a film strip, history cannot be altered, and within the blockhouse universe of eternalism, nothing really happens. That was vile. Yeah, and that's what you mentioned, the cultural aspect where people go back, or in Star Trek, they go back in a loop. But it kind of blends happenings, the presentist view embedded within a eternalist backdrop.
It does, doesn't it? And that, I mean, I really think we need to almost pause there and just let that sink in, right? So if this is true, right, if eternalism, this 4D universe is true, and again, when we say this, let me just back up like 2 feet and say, like, when you even use the word space-time, this is just how embedded this notion is. If you use the word space-time, you have perhaps unknowingly bought into this way of thinking, right? Space-time is not a thing on presentism. Space-time is just made up, conglomeration of things on eternalism. And so this idea that nothing really happens, imagine that. The idea that nothing really happens. That means for a Christian, the only thing, I think, and you could maybe correct me even if I'm wrong here, because this might even get dicey. I think if you're a Christian, the only thing that happens is God creates a universe, right? We at least want to say that. Because the universe is not God, it's a separate entity. But literally the only thing that ever actually happened is God creating a static universe. Like, it's really bizarre, really bizarre.
Right. Now, let's see, my slide changed there. Yes, that's if you go with the full tilt eternalist 4D view. A halfway house that I mentioned earlier is the growing block universe, where you could say as a Christian that God created the universe and history starts growing, like you're adding pages to a book of history. Okay, so so at the beginning there's an empty book, and God creates the first page, and then the second page, third page, fourth page, and the story's not written, but once a page has been put in the book, it becomes unchanging.
Right.
It's
and that's a little more like, I guess that's a little more palatable. It's still not perfect because it still leads to problems with the past, right? In other words, it still leads to some of the philosophical problems that, like, we're going to talk about these later, but just to kind of preview, in the eternalism view, Jesus is always hanging on the cross.
Right, because that's a past event, and even in the growing block universe or the eternalist view.
Correct. Right. But on full tilt eternalism, also, people are created in hell. We'll talk more about that in a minute, right? But on full tilt eternalism, people are created in hell. The growing block universe would actually at least avoid that sort of criticism, I think, right? They wouldn't actually be created in hell.
Correct.
And so, but that's kind of a way. And I think the other reason why the growing block thing might sound more palatable to Christians. And again, I'm not saying this is accurate. I'm just saying it might sound that way because I think a lot of Christians, even like, I don't think a lot of Christians think that the universe is eternal, right? I mean, that view is pretty, I would think, bizarre unless there's just some who've never really given it any thought. God is the only thing that is eternal and unchanging. The universe was a creation of God. There was at some point a creation event and an instantiation of the universe, at which time there was God and everything else. And so I think a lot of Christians think in terms of, well, there was no eternity past for the creation, but there is an eternity future for creation. And so right, because the Bible says that we will live on through eternity with Jesus our Lord. And so I think that might be a more palatable way of looking at this whole approach. But when you realize some of the other theological problems the growing block still has, then it does become less palatable, I think.
Right. Yeah. The when we use the word eternal, there's several significations for that word. When I use the phrase, for example, I think sometimes I said that eternalism makes the universe co-eternal with God. That doesn't mean that I am implying that it's coexisted with God in eternity. It could be created in an instant as a finished product, so to speak. And then that product or that creation is in itself eternal in the sense that it never ceases to exist and it's unchanging, right? So that's the sense of eternal. Then there's the word everlasting also, which has a different signification, right, than the eternal. So, yeah, using the word eternal, I guess, can get us a little bit of trouble sometimes in the way we say it, but there's a context in which it makes sense.
Well, and from a
So,
human perspective, the only time that ever exists would be that. We can't. That's why this stuff is so crazy. We can't. God is not bound by time, right? So it's when we say that God has always existed. What that doesn't mean is like that he existed infinitely in eternal past time of any kind. Time would have come into like play with the creation of the universe. This is why it's more accurate to say if you're trying to discuss like let's say the eternal relationship of love between the Godhead, right? The members of the Trinity. You can't discuss that in some way as, oh, before creation. The best way in human language I know to express it is sans creation or without creation, right? Even before assumes that there was some time bound state prior to creation. And I know it's really hard to wrap our
right,
heads around, but that's just not accurate language. So using accurate language is going to be really helpful here. So I'm glad you
right.
defined that term.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, before the creation, it was the ontological trinity that existed in himself, and temporal, spatial, creaturely categories just don't apply. I
That's
mean, no
right.
one would sit here and say, when was God or where was God? Those creaturely categories just do not apply. He is God. It's God's aseity exists in himself necessarily.
Yep. That's exactly right.
So let's
Okay.
see. Okay, so we were briefly talking about the issue of how did eternalism come on the stage, and the slide I have up at the moment, eternalism in a nutshell. Let me just go down them quickly. So yeah, and again, I want to emphasize we're going to tend to talk in terms of full-fledged eternalism versus full-fledged presentism. Like I said, some of the aspects of full-fledged eternalism also infect the growing block universe, and we'll try to elucidate that as we go on. But I'm going to tend to concentrate on full-fledged eternalism because that is the philosophy that was espoused when space-time was created by Minkowski. And when I say space-time created by Minkowski, it's not ontological; it's a mathematical abstraction, and we'll get into that briefly in just a moment. But so we mentioned this briefly. Eternalism really is a philosophy that time is an illusion. That's nothing. Nothing ever happens. You referred to A series and B series. In presentism, we used tense verbs, but in eternalism, everything exists in a universe in which time has been turned into space. And I've said that in a previous session we had that time is not a place. Okay, so and here's some of the people that espoused it: Einstein, Weil, and others. And I mentioned that the theory of relativity is what really gave it its supposed strong support for eternalism. And I'll just cut down to Minkowski's quote in his lecture that he gave. He says, "The views of space and time, which I wish to lay before you, Here it is in a nutshell. They are radical. Henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. And that independent reality became known as space-time, right, which is the eternalist view. And so let's ask, is eternalism a necessary outgrowth of special relativity? Okay, this is a quote from William Lane Craig, and he states the situation concisely. He says that a physical theory is comprised of two components. First, there's a mathematical formalism, and then also a physical interpretation of that formalism. Okay, so in the case of presentism and eternalism, that physical interpretation is the ontology that you referred to. In other words, does the mathematics compel you to 4D, four-dimensionalism, or not? Can you have a theory that's three-dimensionalism? And Craig goes on to say, competing theories which differ only in virtue of their divergent physical interpretations can be extremely difficult to assess if they are empirically equivalent in their testable predictions. And we'll get into some of the aspects of that a little bit later. Considerations which are metaphysical in nature may then become paramount, and we say amen on that, right?
Yeah.
And we want to embrace a biblical Christian metaphysical / ontological viewpoint.
Yes. Yeah. This is a very helpful and, like you said, very concise quote, right? And this is getting to the thing I mentioned a few minutes ago, that the math is just, how the math applies. The math is not the ontology, right? The math is the math, right?
Right. Yeah. The math is an abstraction, and I'll attempt to get into some of that right now. And I'm going to recapitulate here a Hillary Putnam's argument for eternalism, because this argument, which was written more in philosophical terms rather than a lot of mathematics put in, it was his argument for why you had to be an eternalist if you believed in special relativity. And the point is, as I mentioned earlier, before special relativity, there was an absolute time, the Newtonian time that flowed from past to the present and into the future. While relativity claimed that for different frames of reference, which in the theory was restricted to what is called uniformly moving observers, the issue of the speed of light required that time and space could mix. In other words, what one observer claimed was now, and a different observer would say, well, no, that's not now. I have a different now. And let me just go over this graph here. It portrays me and you, and it times going forward for me, and this is called my world line. That represents my history. So below this point O, that's my history before the present, say O, and mine now. And then I go on into the future. Your world line, if you're moving relative to me, you have a different world line. So everything along this line here is your past, and then this is your future. But special relativity says that what I deem as my present now is this line that goes from O to A, and based upon the Lorentz transformation, what you consider to be your now is OB. Now, Putnam's constructed it so that at event O, we are coincident. What that means, we are equally real to each other, right? We can reach out and shake hands, right? And so we're real to each other, but Putnam wants to say, according to special relativity, A is real to you, that's your now, and he says that B, did I say that right? A is real to me, right? And B is real to you because it's in your now. So if A is real to O, which is common to you and me, and B is real to that, then O, A, and B have to be, quote, simultaneously, unquote, real to both of us. And that's the argument in a nutshell. So he's saying A and B have to coexist because they're real, right? So
Right.
B that's in my past because it occurs before this horizontal line is real. Now, I believe he's equivocating on real, and he fundamentally misunderstands the mathematics of special relativity. And I guess I'm going to jump ahead here, and I have another slide that illustrates this. When special relativity says that I render OA as at the same time, it turns out that I could not see A. Why is that? Any event that's at some distance from me, I can't see because that would require speed of light to be infinite. I can only see A that it has occurred in the future. So I'm unaware of A
Right.
at t equals 0, and actually you're unaware of B at your t prime. In other words, you can only compute this t prime for B later after a photon has arrived at your eyes.
Yeah.
If you're following what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
And I need to go on with I have it right here. So on the next slide, I show this is a common misconception in special relativity, and the mistake is made in many books. They will say, after you've done a Lorentz transformation, that you see certain things happening, or you perceive certain things happening, or you observe certain things happening. And as I said previously on the prior slide, both of us at O, neither of us can perceive A or B. And I've illustrated that for the case of A, that if I have this green light ray coming out at finite speed, the speed of light, I will become aware of A at the event A, little small little a here.
Mm-hmm.
And you will become aware of A at this A prime up here when the light ray arrives at your eyeballs. It's only at that moment that I can do a theoretical calculation, and I will say it occurred at t equals 0, and you will say it occurred at some time later, right? So, right, not and go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask. So, and this might be putting you on the spot a little, but so as I look at this diagram, this makes complete sense to me. I actually understand what you're saying, but I wonder, are we so far in the math right here that there's not some example event we could just point to illustrate this example? Is there something that we could look at and say, here, this is an example of this by chance?
Are you saying like a more concrete example?
Yeah. An analogy of sorts, something that we could point at, I mean, Tycho tried to do something similar to this, I think, with the idea of starlight being created on day 4 and then reaching Earth. So I don't know if that's the kind of example that works to kind of show what you're trying to illustrate here, or if there's not really a good one, if it's purely math.
Yeah, I'm not certain there is. I mean, what we could say is that I transported a flashlight or something, or a beacon out to point A, and of course I had to do it before O, right? Because I can't transport a beacon instantaneously from O to A.
Right.
So this is going to get into some issues of, can we synchronize clocks? And the answer is yes, you can.
Right.
Okay, so I transport the beacon out to A, and it's time to go to flash at time 0. Okay, so I started it out, and then it flashes. It's going to take a finite amount of time to travel the distance d from O to A and arrive at A in a time, according to my clock, of O to A, right? So that's the finite speed of light. That would be a concrete example. And
Gotcha.
then after the fact, I can only compute certain things about the time by doing the Lorentz transformation. I could do the Lorentz transformation and determine what time you're going to say it occurred based upon my observation of it flashing at A, because I know you've passed me. I know that
Yeah.
you're traveling at v receding away from me.
But that's only
So
retrospective. I mean, you can only do that because the photon has hit you, and now you can go back and do a Lorentz transformation. But you
yeah,
can't
yeah,
see it happen. It's like you can just see a Lorentz transformation. Like you said.
yeah, you can't. Yeah, you cannot see a Lorentz contraction. And
Right.
I should have produced a slide to show this. What you see of the supposed rigid rod contracting depends upon whether it's receding or incoming. If it's incoming, you always see the trailing edge in the past, further in the past, than you see the bleed edge, right? So that actually means it looks longer. While if it's receding, then you see the trailing edge in the past, before you see the trail. I should have drawn the diagram. But yeah, it's not, the Lorentz contraction says it always contracts the rigid rod, but what we see is different depending upon whether it's approaching or receding.
Right.
So,
And go back to the previous slide because there was one point on the previous slide I wanted us to make. Yeah. Right. So this is the problem. Your last point down there is because we need to talk about why this whole view, like, okay, so we've talked about the argument for eternalism from Putnam, but now it's like, okay, well, does it work? Is it really an argument? And I think your point here is that actually it's not a proof for eternalism at all. It simply presupposes eternalism. So can you talk about that specifically?
yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it. See if
Well,
I
you
can
put it. I
untangle
read
that.
your words.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I think I need to do the mathematics to show that. It's because the time coordinates are just computed, right?
Right.
So, and we always see things in the past, right? And we see things along the null cone, and that's all we ever see is the past null cone, is events along the past null cone. And that holds for any observer according to special relativity. So,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, in a nutshell, the point that you can get different times assigned to A, and that's not what, if I would put another, another space line for U, it would intersect. Actually, I should scribble on this. Okay, let's see if I can draw a line here. For U, let me start here. This is your present at a time later.
Okay.
Okay. So, see, I computed it, it was time 0, but you claim that when you're here, it was at this time. That's T prime of event A for you. And T sub A for me is equal to 0. Right. So, the calculation claims that there's a different T time for A depending upon whether it's you or me. And they put ontological significance to those times, saying that they both exist, if you're following what I'm saying. But that's just a mathematical computation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this Minkowski space that I'm drawing here is just an abstraction.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
So I don't know if that helped or.
Yeah, well, I think so. I guess kind of the main point we're trying to underscore here is like, that no matter how you do the math, right? I mean, he's just this is the best. Arguably, this is the best that you've got in terms of trying to argue for eternalism. But again, it's just a mathematical construct, right? I mean, so it doesn't actually argue for eternalism.
Right.
That's the point we're
Right.
trying to make. Is you can do the math in a presentist case too, right? It just looks different, I imagine. But what is that? I don't know if I'm asking the right question. What's the math look like for a presentist? I don't know.
Well, we will use special relativity, but we just don't necessarily ascribe an absolute significance to any one observer as to what is the time.
Right.
Yep. What is now. What special relativity says, it doesn't deny that there could be an absolute now. It's just that we cannot determine what it is.
Gotcha.
Right. So
Gotcha.
it's basically not observable. And anyway, to reiterate again, Putnam's argument, like I said, got rid of the math and used this word real. And we're making an excursus into the math where you have different coordinates, t prime and t, and he says they're both real, I guess.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, see, I had to introduce another reference point for this t prime of a, which was up here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know if I'm on the right point because I'm
So,
looking at my present. Okay.
yeah.
So
You are. Yep.
let's see. Okay. So I think we've said all we need to say on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, here you're right. So you asked a question about the presentist point of view. We mentioned this earlier. In eternalism, I've drawn a picture here of a pendulum. So either think of a metronome, going back and forth, or a pendulum on a string. So time's going forward and up, down, and space is left, right. So I've drawn a few positions of the pendulum bob here as it's moving along. Well, see, the word moving doesn't even make sense.
Doesn't
Right?
even make sense, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
right. Yeah. So in the eternalist view, all these bobs are like a continuous string of beads.
It's a continuous blob of bobs.
Yeah, that's right. It's a pendulum worm, right?
Right.
And so the bob exists and is real at all places and times. It's a worm in space time. And so Bob is not at a single time and place, but the Bob is everywhere, every when, right?
Yep.
Or the every when of, okay. Now in presentism, I've drawn a line here called now. And if you imagine that as a wire that the bead is on, wire, so this is an abstraction, of course. We don't have a wire extending into the future in eternalist view, but it's so that view this as a graph that you would have done in high school of a sine curve. And as this line moves, of course, you're going to trace out a motion picture, right?
Yeah.
You're going to, and that's the presentist point of view. So the pendulum bob is at a single place, single time and place. And so here it is at now, it's at this place, and then at a later time, it's at this location. So
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I've tried to emphasize here, I'm going to call this a space-time graph of the pendulum motion. Space-time is an abstraction the same way that if in algebra you would graph y equals mx plus b, a line or whatever, right? It's an abstraction. So, or you draw, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, I was gonna shift a little bit, but still using this slide. So no, please keep going.
Right. So down here I'm saying x equals a function of time. That's what we did in high school, right? We would plot,
Yeah.
A function is a function of time, and it's the same thing when we do predictions, right? If we have an equation that says how a fluid's going to flow or the pendulum's going to move, we can take an observation of where it is now and predict where it's going to be later. Well, that's just a plot of that function. Or we can say where, if it had existed before this time, where would it have been in the past? Now, we've always pointed out as creationists that extrapolation in the past is inadmissible, right? Because you haven't observed the past.
Right.
And for instance, if I showed you a motion picture of a pendulum moving, and I omitted from the film strip, to get back to our film strip analogy, the fact that I hit it with a hammer, off before I started the camera, all you would see is the bob moving, right? And if you looked at that film and said, well, I can predict where it was 4 seconds ago, well, it was stationary because I hadn't hit it with the hammer yet.
Yeah.
You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, of course.
Predicting in the past is illegitimate. You unless you know all of the conditions prior to when you started recording, it's just an abstraction. So the future projection is an abstraction. The past extrapolation is an abstraction, right?
So when you hear, let me try to make this somewhat, and I might be asking an entirely different question here. So this is where some of my ignorance with this stuff comes in handy, because then you can smooth it out for me. Dr. Hugh Ross, one of his trope is not really a good word, but it's just a word I'm going to use. One of the tropes that he kind of commonly retreats to is that as an astronomer, when he looks through a telescope, he's looking into the past. Now, am I conflating the use of the word past between those two things, or is he assuming eternalism indeed by using that language?
That's kind of a loose language, and I will even say that we're looking, when you say into, kind of confuses it, I guess. Yeah, you've
Well,
stressed the
in other
correct
words,
point.
he says that we're looking. He's like, I
We're
can look through my
looking at the
telescope at the
past.
early universe. That's what he says.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, you're seeing the universe as it was.
Yeah. Right.
Is the best way of saying it. That's because,
Yeah.
back to the other example, for the event A, I'm not aware of the event A until a time later. So
Right.
when I see the A that I'm seeing is in the time t equals 0 on that
Right.
prior slide,
Right.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, you're looking at the past, you're seeing things as they were, and the same thing goes with uh, you know any light signal propagation. It's always something you're seeing a present effect due to a past event,
Right. A present
right?
effect due to a past event. Right.
Past event, right? That's
Gotcha.
what you're seeing in the telescope, and of
Right.
course, that's the crux of the light travel time problem, right?
Correct. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to make
So,
sure we were sort of, not getting confused between those. So it really is two different things, right? We're not saying that the past still it exists, but we do have to deal with the reality that a photon hitting us obviously happens a certain amount of time after the actual event took place.
right. So I've put back the misconceptions and special relativity slide again.
Yeah.
So again, so that's the event. I'm at O, and according to special relativity, I can compute A and things like that. But if A is a distant galaxy and that green line is the light emitted by that galaxy at time denoted by lowercase a, I'm seeing the photon that was emitted at capital A
Right.
in the future, right? At a later time, right? So A
Right.
will be a present event at time t sub a, little lower a, uh, as the result of the light coming from the galaxy at capital A.
All right. And when the light hits us at capital A, again, or excuse me, at little a,
Small
at
a.
A prime. Yep, at little a. Um, we what we are seeing there is the event as it was when the light was first emitted at it, which means capital A has changed since then, but we won't see it yet until the future, right?
Correct.
Perfect. Right.
So
So that's why these
yeah,
are two separate issues.
right, yeah, the event at lowercase a is different than the event capital A. Those are two different things. So
Right.
if you use the language that you're looking into the past, you're really only seeing an event that's in your present, basically co-located with your eye, correct?
Yeah, yeah. All right, and
Right.
and now to really, and this might be interesting because I think we're finally like really nailing into an issue here. I know this is not the ASC podcast. We've already talked about this, but this language is actually helping us get to something very important. Now, Lyle, Dr. Jason Lyle, has debated Dr. Hugh Ross a number of times, and as you might imagine, Dr. Lyle takes lots of issues with Dr. Ross saying that we can look back in time, right? So you could, if I'm headed on the wrong track or even boarding the wrong train, Phil, here, you could tell me. But it seems to me like what Lyle then wants to do is say, oh well, since we can't know the one-way speed of light, we can, but Lyle says that we can't. Then he wants to get around Ross by essentially saying that, well, we've decided that the one-way speed of light is the right way to
Infinite.
say it, infinitely moving toward us. And so, wouldn't he want to say that we actually are seeing capital A as it is right now,
Instantaneously. Oh, exactly.
instantaneously?
He uses that phrase. He says we see the universe in real time.
Exactly.
So
That right
right.
there. It's taken what 4 podcast episodes now to get to ultimately the best visual and the crux of the issue. But I think I think that's the thing, is that you can't imagine you have the ontology of the universe, and you have the reality of the fact that you don't see you don't see the light from a distant object until it hits you. I mean, this is just a this I mean, this really seems like a very normal thing to understand. It's not very hard to understand, and especially
Right.
now we're dealing with the scale of the universe. So we're not even talking about in localities, and we know that in localities we can measure the one-way speed of light. We have it on the femtosecond camera that we showed you in the very first episode
Right.
that we did. And so now that is the crux of the matter. Can we really just choose to say that we're seeing the light from A in real time? And when you think about it that way, that just seems impossible. It's just not dealing with the ontology, the reality of the universe. And maybe I'm missing
Right.
something, but it seems very obvious to me when it's put that way.
Yeah, Lyle is unfortunately taking a operational epistemological question and enforcing an ontology, and he does so by just doing some mathematics, which we've tried to point out here that the mathematics cannot dictate reality. And we've mentioned that the ASC is nothing more than a coordinate transformation, and coordinate transformations cannot alter reality.
Right.
Right.
Very good.
So,
Very good.
yeah, we can't change this. Yeah. And we had the other examples we adduced, which is, for example, the New Horizons. It takes 4.5 hours for the signals to get from the New Horizons to the Earth. And
Right.
that's all due to the fact that they had a very stable clock that they synchronized with the Earth clock before the mission started. And it took 9.5 years to reach Pluto. And using special relativity, which Lyle agrees with, and the notion of time dilation, which he agrees with because it's an invariant, we can show that the New Horizons clock only lost a second, a half a second, right?
Yeah.
So, and it takes, so we look at the time it transmitted it and the time we received it, and at worst, that's off by a half a second.
Yep.
And we get 4.5 hour transmission time. So, yeah, and GPS doesn't work, as we mentioned. It just doesn't work, as we pointed out. And I wasn't aware of that debate with Hugh Ross, but yeah, if you can refresh my memory what he said, he's basically saying you don't see in the past, you see right now. So he's just basically asserting his ASC, right? And that's not a proof. He's just objecting to what, yeah, right. Hugh Ross says we're seeing an event that occurred in the past, which is the way I take it when you say you look into the past.
Yep.
And Lyle saying, based on my ASC, no, you see it right now.
Right. Well, and that's the argument, right? That's what he wants to argue.
Well, but
we can choose our synchrony convention, right?
But he needs to just, in a debate like that, which I know sometimes you can't do it because the audience isn't mathematically savvy. You know, he needs to go through and give an explanation. And I really hate to say he gives, and I probably should produce some more slides, and maybe we can have another addendum. At the 2018 ICC, he presented a slide which was animated, which he animated his ASC transform, and he shows the null cone being distorted. And I think I may have had a slide in one of the previous podcasts. And that's illegitimate. In other words, what he's drawing and animating, he seems to be saying he made the speed of light go from finite to infinite, but he actually changed the meaning of what space was when he did that.
All right, well, I'll tell you what. Let's move on here. There's one more point I think we want to make for sure, and maybe that's where some of these slides come in here that you're going to show next. But I know one thing that we wanted to talk about is, well, let's see. So the slide that you got up right now, this is dealing with the fact that with a temporally bounded universe. So I want to hit that and the idea real quick that space-time is not an arena to kind of demystify that, and then we'll move on to some of the theological, philosophical things.
Okay, yeah, the question came up in special relativity. You have a block universe that extends from the infinite past to the infinite future. And of course, the 3D space is infinite in all three directions. So the question is, could there be a eternalist view of a temporally bounded universe? And the answer is yes. So what I've drawn here, this is a slide I gave at the 2018 ICC. On the left, I have a graphical view of what I call two big bangs. I have a big bang on the left, which has, it has more mass, and the big bang on the right has less mass. So the big bang on the left comes into existence after the big bang on the right, because time's going from bottom to top. And this is for the bounded solution. So you've probably heard that one of the big questions is, does the universe expand and contract, or does it keep on expanding forever? This is a solution that says the universe expands, reaches a maximum size, and then starts falling back in. Sort of like throwing a ball up into the air, which is a gravitational effect. If you don't have enough energy to escape the Earth's gravitational field, it'll reach a high point, and then turn around and fall back and hit the ground again. And that's called the big crunch. So I have two segments of this eternalist universe. One lasts a shorter amount of time than the other one. And I've drawn an arrow across, that heavy blue arrow, which we'll call that a now. And on the right, I've drawn what it looks like. So you got this spherical-like large universe, and this smaller little globe at the bottom. And you have a throat between them, which is those dashed lines on the left. And that's known as an Einstein-Rosen bridge. And that shows you what might be called the universe at a given now. Let me draw on the slide. Yeah, I can do it here. If we took a presentist point of view, whoops, no, that doesn't work. We finally reach a point where this one goes out of existence. This drawing's pretty bad. So if we call this a now, this one's already entered the big crunch, right? And this one still exists. So this sphere here ceases to exist, if I can even say that, before this one. Anyway, I've gone between presentism and eternalism, I guess, in my description there, which is probably going to confuse the audience a little bit. But to the eternalist, the diagram on the left exists eternally. It doesn't have to, have a infinite past. It just is, right? And so things happen, things don't happen.
Right.
This is just it. Right.
And this goes back to the point we made near the very beginning, which is that just because we're saying the word eternal, we should not confuse this with like a steady state theory, like an infinite past. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about from the moment that time began until the end of the last moment in time, right? In other words, just speaking in terms, there's like a first moment and a last moment, and everything in between there. It's all part of that space-time blob, right? It's as if this is going to be a terrible example, but it's as if God had a Lego universe sitting on his anthropomorphic dresser, and everything static was inside of that. And then those are the various moments of all of our lives, but it doesn't mean that the actual Lego construction itself was eternally existent. It is temporally bounded, and it's a space-time blob. But that's what is meant in eternalism.
Right. There's various varieties of solutions of the mathematical equations, and the one I just showed was the closed universe that has a beginning and an end. And you could put a growing block universe notion on that too. Might be a little bit more difficult. But there's the open solution, which has a beginning, the Big Bang, but then keeps going forever into the future. And you could easily put a growing block universe on that.
Yeah.
So, and the secularists talk about these different solutions as what's the fate of the universe? Does the universe, was it a Big Bang and then a big crunch, collapse?
Yeah.
Or is it one that has enough energy from the Big Bang that expands forever? And then they call that the heat death, right? So they say the universe just grows dark. It gets to the point where you can't see any other stars because they're receding faster, than the light will be able to reach you. So everything will end in utter darkness, right?
Right, unless they believe in the growing block. That's actually an inevitability that has already happened. in that.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah,
That.
Eternalist. Yes, right. Yeah. So,
Yep.
yeah, it's the universe where nothing happens.
Exactly.
So, all right. So now, yeah, you mentioned perhaps some people view space time as an arena. Now, that's based upon actually taking the abstraction seriously as a real thing. So it's like a blank tablet that can have things written inside of it. So that's what I've shown on the left here. I'm talking about abstract space time, and it's empty, and there's no events. Nothing, how do you say this? So I've used the word nothing happens in the sense that nothing temporally happens.
Right.
Uh, but in this diagram on the left, there's no events, right? There's no activity. I guess maybe that's the better way to say it. Uh, Now, on the right, I've filled up the arena with actual occupants. So let's put it that way. They're occupants of space time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've drawn 4 world lines labeled A, B, C, and D. And again, a world line is just the mathematical expression of a history. That's actually a better way of wording it.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have the history of capital A, and you see it, if you spatialize it in space-time, you have a point where A begins, right? And I guess if this is a person, then you can have a point where A ends, right? So that's a
Yes.
finite, temporally bounded space-time worm. And then I can have B, and then of course C. I've drawn C as a light ray, and it goes infinite past, infinite future, and then likewise with D. So that's the eternal Minkowski space-time, and I've shown, the special case of A, one that begins and ends, and ones that do not begin and end. They
Yeah.
extend infinitely in time in both directions, and those would be the 4D worms, right?
Yep.
So I mean, a capital A is still a worm; it just has a head and a tail, right?
Yeah.
And B is a space-time worm, right? And infinitely long, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yep.
do you
Yeah.
want to get to this issue, right?
Yeah. Well, we're getting there. We're getting there speedily. So, right. So, just to kind of highlight that, the issue, I mean, there could be some more sophisticated, like, because there's Christian, actually, eternalists. I mean, there are Christians who purposefully argue for eternalism and think that's the best view. And so we're going to kind of get to why that may or may not be. But with that issue, like, go back to the last slide just for the viewers, so that yeah, right. So in that scenario, it's not as though we again have this blank canvas, this blank slate in which time can be written and therefore things still happen. You just have to realize this is actually a really, really good transition point into our next set of issues here. You just have to realize is that what God created was the thing on the right. Right?
Right,
What God created, your beginning and your end. It's in a static, unchanging way. You're not actually doing anything. You're actually not a participant in your own life. In fact, the concept of you is entirely made up. You
right,
are not a single person. You are simply depending on how you look at it, and there's multiple views, things that we're not going to be able to unpack here, but basically you are a set of temporal parts. There is not a you.
right,
To even say
right,
you is honestly just to say, you can't even say your history. Even there's something even a little bit deceptive, honestly, about the, like, okay, let's take A. A ends, A begins. Let's say that's a person. Well, if I'm understanding eternalism correctly, that should have been a dotted line instead of a single line. Because if you actually look at that single line, I think you could look at that and say, oh, that's a person. That's you. That's the full existence of you. In reality, there should be little micro dots in between that actually make that a discontinuous line. And you are an entirely different person in many different senses, from one little dot to the next. Those are
right.
different
Because
versions.
you change, you persist through time, and your actions are real, and you change. I mean, you grow from before you existed, before you were conceived, right?
Yep.
Then you go from
Yeah.
a baby in the womb to You're born, and then you grow, you're changed, and we've mentioned
Hmm.
before that even your body changes.
Yeah.
Its constituents because you eat
Yep.
and grow new cells and so on and so forth that didn't exist prior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, which gets
Okay.
us into the theological point that what an individual is in Christian theism is really your immaterial essence, right? It's your soul spirit, right?
Yes, correct. Well, let's go into that. Let's go ahead and head into some of those philosophical and theological issues.
Well, I don't know. Should we put a footnote here also? Like I said, we were going to not keep talking about the growing block universe. That would be a halfway house
Mm.
for a theist to say that, well, God didn't create this thing in toto at the moment of creation. There would be some line down here someplace, right? Let me see if I can find out where to draw this. Creation, right? And then the block would start growing like pages of a book, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'd drawing a whole bunch of pages of the book. And these don't cease to exist, right? So, and then time trying to draw these straight, which I can't do. So as time goes on, so this is history written to here, right? On A, right, at a given age. So A was born here, and here's A now. But at this point, your birth still exists. It's still real. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So so again, this,
This is the growing block universe in red.
yeah. And it just only solves, it might be fair to say that it solves half the problems, but the half that it doesn't solve are still very problematic, I think, for a Christian theist.
Oh, yes, it does. Well, we'll see that on the next slide. I should add here that the growing block universe still kind of runs afoul of if you're going to use the special relativity argument, because
Mm.
of the Putnam argument. If I draw
Yeah.
different time axes, I start putting time axes that go into the future.
Before, yeah,
Right.
and
So,
you're gonna,
yeah.
right. You can't. I don't know the right way to say this, but you can't factor a Lorentz transformation or whatever where there's nothing to transform to in the future, right? I don't know if
Or before creation. That's
or
right.
before
So you'd
creation,
have to
right?
clip them. You'd have to clip them. Yeah, see, so it actually kind of smuggles in presentism. That's why I call it a halfway house. You'd have to make the
Yeah.
Lorentz transformations end at some now, but which now do you choose? Actually,
Yeah.
I wonder if I should go back to the prior
Uh,
slide. Let me, this one here. Yeah, you can see that. So I'm back on Putnam's argument for eternalism. So your now has now time points in that, which is it to the future of my now, right over here to the left,
yeah.
right. So whose now dictates what now is in the
What
growing
now
block
is?
universe,
Yeah, that's really
right?
interesting.
Right. So that's kind of a fly in the ointment of the growing block universe. That's why I'm saying it smuggles in aspects of presentism.
Wow,
Anyway, so
it sure does.
okay, so I talked about the growing block universe here on this slide, and also the eternalist view. And hopefully, I hope the audience viewers can ascertain that GBU and eternalism full tilt kind of share the same problems, right? Anyway,
Yes.
so let's go. So let's take the case of A. I guess I'm calling him Albert now. It starts with an A. And so this is, you mentioned we want to get into some of the theological, philosophical issues. And this, to me, this is a major, actually, this may be the best pushback on any a Christian that would want to hold to either the growing block universe uh, or eternalism per se. So we pointed out that Albert is actually a body and soul, and he would exist eternally in the eternalist reality, or his past would exist eternally in a growing block universe eternalist point of view, right? So here again, I have Albert born, right? And he's born lost, correct?
Yeah.
So I've drawn that segment of his existence in red. And I've drawn a line here from with minus infinity to plus infinity, which could represent a given now. So everything below that horizontal line is still real. So Albert Born is still real, right? And then finally, at a future event, Albert is born again, right? Then Albert dies, and then Albert is resurrection. Okay, so ultimately, even in the growing block universe, I keep going back to that because I keep thinking that some people are going to want to assert that that's what certain people are saying.
It's probably worth mentioning that the GBU is actually very it is not by any means a mainstream view. In my looking it up, the experts, if you will, are even very dismissive of it. So, I mean, for anyone who would want to punt there, I think I should just let you know that it's a very, it's not a
Yes,
widely accepted view of what they actually think is going on. It's really either
right.
eternalism or presentism.
Exactly. It's like you have to have a equilibrium point, and GBU is in a state of disequilibrium. It's not equipoise,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
It uses elements of presentism, right? So what it does, it denies the future is real, is all it does, right? So it
That's right.
excises the future. And we're showing an example here that once certain events that are real events and truth, according to Christian theism, once they're in the past, they stay there, right?
Yep.
Now, the growing block universe will get rid of some of the issues that we're probably going to mention, like God directly creating evil, because the GBU advocate will say, well, no, he didn't, right?
Right.
But to make the point, you're right. Very few people adhere to the growing block universe because it has problem. It gets riddled by both camps.
Yep. All right. So to put some of this in sort of um, to handle some of the Christianese here, right? What your diagram currently is showing is that actually the old man and the new man exist eternally at the same time,
Correct. Right.
right? The old
Correct.
man and the new man actually coexist. You are, in what sense does it mean for you to be saved? And again, it's worse than that. In eternalism, I feel like, let me just go here. So this is directly from the Stanford Encyclopedia, because this personhood and identity thing is actually really important. It says, according to three dimensionalism, the thing which is three dimensionalism is presentism. And just think about yourself before I keep reading this. Think about yourself as a Christian theist and how you think about identity. Think about this. Quote, according to three dimensionalism, the thing that was doing whatever you were doing at noon yesterday was you. It was you who was doing that. And now you are doing something different, namely reading this sentence. So the relation between you then and you now is identity. According to four dimensionalism, on the other hand, the thing that was doing whatever you were doing at noon yesterday was an earlier temporal part of the thing that is you. And the thing that is doing what you are doing now is the present temporal part of you, end quote. So as we look at this, it's so important to understand that even the concept of identity falls apart with this. So what does it mean for your old man and new man to be redeemed? The problem is that there's millions of iterations. I don't even know the right language to use, but there's millions of iterations of your old man and millions of iterations of your new man, and they are all existing in the same blob of space-time on eternalism.
Right.
And
Right.
that
Yeah, exactly.
includes the you, by the way, that includes the you that was born. Well, let me just let you go ahead with that because I'm going to get ahead of myself if I keep going.
Yeah. The way I've said it, what the Stanford Encyclopedia said, is keying on the word thing in that extract.
Yep.
Right. The thing that you are is that 4D worm, according to eternalism, right?
Yep.
That's the thing that is you, right?
Right. Now, let's go to another issue. I know we're kind of jumping around on what's on the screen, but we're still talking about all those things. Let's look at this. So, what if you're never saved, right? You're not like Albert in there. What if you're never saved? Well, that means that from the moment of creation, you were actually created damned. You were created eternally damned in hell, right? That is a necessary outworking of this view. That means you had no Again, nothing happened in your life
Right. Yeah,
where
you have no free agency, is what it
no free
means.
agency at all. There's no way to
Right.
move. Right. No, depending on how you, and that's another can of worms, depending on how you even look at that, regardless, nothing ever happened. There was no
Right.
moving toward Christ. There was no moving away from Christ. There was just simply what is. And that includes you being created eternally in hell. And people who were or who never get saved, they were actually created eternally in hell. And that is extremely
Yeah.
problematic from a Christian theistic point of view.
Exactly. And that bears on the first bullet we have there, which says, "Is God's eternity more compatible with eternalism?" I had that question raised to me at the 2018 ICC, and perhaps now I can give a more concise and cogent explanation. Talking about, I think some people use the phrase that God sees the future. I've
Yep.
heard that phrase.
Or that God is timeless. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which,
God is timeless and He exists in the eternal now, and He can see the future. Well, God doesn't know the future by some sort of empirical looking at something, but that would be compatible with the eternalist point of view, right?
Mhm.
It's a completed object and He can look at it, but of course He created it that way. So
yeah.
the answer is that no, I don't think God's eternity is more compatible with eternalism, right? So.
Right. Yep. Yeah. No, it's just as, God's eternity is just as consistent with presentism as it is with eternalism. It's certainly, even if it is compatible in some sense with both, it's certainly not more compatible in one than another. And that there's lots of theological rabbit trails you could go down here, but suffice it to say that presentism works just as eternalism works, and there's been lots of thought from Christian philosophers sort of put into that. Here's another interesting thing: is that history matters in the Bible. And that's a point that I wanted to make sure that we made. And the reason is because I'm a real like biblical studies nerd, and I love studying ancient Near Eastern worldviews and like just thinking about the Bible as an ancient document. And one of the core things that separates the children of Israel, separates the Hebrews from all of their neighbors in the ancient world, was that they had this importance on remembrance and importance on history, and they could look back in their past and they could see, hey, this happened and that happened and this happened, and this is why we observe this and this is why we observe that. And it's just nonsensical to talk about that sort of thing if an eternalist paradigm is true, because none of that stuff ever really happened. So I think we really do want to preserve the ability to look at a past event, right? To look at history, to look at something that once occurred, is no longer occurring, and say, well, we're going to remember that event in this particular way. Again, I know the ancient Israelites are not writing from a scientific perspective at all. No biblical writer has presentism and eternalism in mind. But what they do have in mind is the importance of true history having really happened, and it really matters now, right? That's the point.
Right. Yeah. And the scriptures are written with tense to verbs, right? So
yes, right. That's correct.
Now the eternalist would push back like Einstein did. He'll say, well, time's just an illusion. Right. Or as Weil said, that our consciousness somehow creates the temporal perception, that's the idealistic point of view, right? That it's your mind is what stamps that reality. Well, I guess it's not a reality because Einstein said it was an illusion. Right. And Weil also said nothing ever happens, right? So, yeah, that runs counter to common sense. It runs counter to the scriptures foremost, right? So,
well, again, it's to the major point. Yeah, everything you said is true, but the other major point of that is that in comparison to other worldviews where they're more pantheistic in nature, like most ancient worldviews, when they talked about their gods, right? They thought about the universe in very cyclical ways, right? Patterns just repeating themselves over and over. The gods, nature being some sort of a manifestation of the gods. That's why they would have gods of the storm, God of the water, God of the wind.
Right.
It's a the Dr. John Oswalt, an Old Testament professor, the way that he puts it is that the ancient worldviews, most of them were based on this idea of continuity, right? Everything being continuous, which reminds me, in a sense, of eternalism, right? It's just everything just kind of is, and there's this fundamental relation between everything that is, and the universe itself is God in some sense. Whereas for Israel, there was this transcendence, right? God is separate from creation and occasionally dips into creation, right? I know that some of this language is hard to grasp, but he
Right.
occasionally, right? He puts his finger in it, right? He acts within creation. There's
Yeah.
a whole branch of philosophy called divine action, right? He actually acts within creation, and that produces real results in real history. So that matters, biblically speaking.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I would say that God is eternally present in the creation. I mean, we know Christ is holding the very matter together, so he's
Correct.
acting.
Yep.
Uh, right. And when we
I
say
agree.
God's hand is revealed, that's he manifests things to special revelation, right? So
Correct.
if he doesn't intervene, the natural order that is held together by Christ continues. But
Yeah. Yep.
to yeah,
Well, two more sort of obviously very easy to grasp important points here, and then we can start to move on to the practical things before we wrap up. Certainly appreciate everyone's patience hanging out with us for this long, but this is a really deep subject, so lots of things to unwind here. The next one that I see, and this is just a huge issue, is that if eternalism is true, then you have got Christ eternally on the cross, right?
correct.
Um,
And that you're right, and that holds in pure eternalism. And again, I keep coming back to growing block universe, right? So once Christ was
right.
crucified, he's still right. He's still on the cross, right?
Correct. Right now, today, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and
Right.
boy, that
Yeah, and if you could time travel, you could go back and witness it, right?
that's
Which
right.
is brings us to another point that you've raised, very, very cogent point.
Yes. Yes, and we're going to get to some of the practical stuff here in just a second, which I think you guys are going to find very interesting. So Christ is eternally on the cross. I mean, that really doesn't even require much more elaboration to know how problematic that is.
Right.
But then
Well,
the
he's still in the
final
tomb. He's still in the tomb,
He's still in
right?
the tomb. That's right. He's still on the cross, still in the tomb. Boy, that kind of messes up all of our hymns and all of our good gospel songs too, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Not that those are define reality, but again, the way you think about God matters. So,
Right.
um, the last point, and this might be, I don't know if this is the most important one, but boy, it sure gets up there, is that God not only created evil, not only is evil eternal, but God never actually defeats evil. Evil always has existed and always will exist in an
Right.
eternalist universe.
Right.
And boy, I mean, that robs me of any semblance of hope. I don't know about you.
Well, if you like being a 4D worm, I guess maybe you'll have some consolation, right?
I suppose so. Yeah, I suppose so. But, that's not how I think about myself typically.
Oh, I know. Yeah,
You know?
little bit in jest there, but
Yeah.
I think Einstein, when one of his friends passed, wrote to his widow and said, "Well, he still exists," So
Yeah.
that was his
Yeah.
consolation, right? Oh
Yeah.
boy, right?
Right, it's really real, and I'll make a brief mention. That is where, when you start reading behind some of the philosophy on this, boy, I mean, your hair will just start turning gray faster than you could possibly realize, because there's all this stuff about truth maker theory, and, well, what does it mean to talk about, like, if the past truly goes away, can we even talk about it? In other words, is the only reason that we can talk about Christ having ever been hanging on the cross is because that in some sense he still is. That's what some of the argumentation, the lines of argument for eternalism from a philosophical perspective go down. So if you're interested in that, you can read a bunch of esoteric stuff on it. But speaking from a common sense perspective, I don't think that's necessary. It seems perfectly fine to me that we can talk about something having had happened and it not still be happening in some eternalist 4D block universe.
Right. Yeah, that issue gets back to what you mentioned, the linguistic foundation of the A series and the B series. Right.
Right.
And I've dipped into some of these essays. I mean, there's books written on see, this is how it gets into blending epistemology and ontology. So epistemology is what we know, right?
Yeah.
Knowledge. And
Yeah.
ontology is things that exist. And the issue of, if I have a statement, how can I say it's true, right? Which is what you alluded to.
Yep.
Something that's in the past, can you say that is still true? So I think they get wrapped around the axle pretty quickly on
I think so too.
truth. Yeah. So there's like books written on time and truth, things like that, right?
Yep.
So that
Mm-hmm.
right. So you got an ontological issue with time, which actually gets blurred with special relativity, some epistemological issues getting in there, right? And then
Yeah.
logic, right? So yeah, well put, right? Yeah,
Good. All right. Well, so that is, I feel like, just in some sense scratching the surface, but suffice it to say, there's a lot of theological and philosophical problems. Now, there's also some more cultural and practical considerations. This is one actually that, because we started talking, Phil, when we were prepping for this, we started talking about the movie Interstellar, and you made an interesting observation about actually man being his own savior. So elaborate on that a little bit.
well, yeah. In the movie, remember, a wormhole gets created, which turns out to be a man of the future creating the wormhole so that they can visit those distant possible habitable planets, very quickly. And then also, he goes into the Tesseract, right? And so he can communicate into the past. So the human race was on the brink of extinction, and future man saves man of the past, right? And of course, that's purely humanistic, also, right? The thing of paramount importance in a godless universe is preservation of the species,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of the time travel movies, you have characters that have things in the past they regret. They want to go back and fix them, right? And cases of extinction, we got to fix that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and
And
it's so interesting because movies like that have always given me such a hard time, probably just because I fail to understand this. But I think it's fair to say that our intuitions are so presentist in nature that it's hard to imagine how anything like that could ever be possible. So even though I know it's just a movie, I'm watching Interstellar and I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. What a cop out. He just has future man you know, save the human race or whatever. But then
right,
when you learn about what eternalism really is, you're like, okay, well, it all exists at the same time. So it's
right,
not, there is nothing happening. So him going
right,
back isn't actually anything that ever happened from the moment of creation, whatever that was. It had already been the case that he would go back in time. That's why it works, right? That's why within its own system, the eternalist notion works of man being able to come back and save himself in something like that. It's actually consistent in an
right,
eternalist space-time 4D universe. Now the question is
right,
that the kind of universe that we're living in? Our intuitions say no. The math is neutral, and from a Christian theological perspective, I think we would want to eschew that view very heavily. So
right.
that's the
Yeah,
crux
I
of
think
the
there was
issue.
a subtlety in Interstellar that's different than a lot of the other time travel movies. Technically, what he did was he communicated with what I can't remember the movie's details, but he communicated into the past via gravitational waves going through what's called the bulk of string theory.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
he was in the Tesseract, remember, and he could be behind the bookcase in the library, right?
Yeah.
And he would thump it, and the dust would move, and he was sending Morse code,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
finally, it was figured out, right? So it
Yeah.
was communicate. Yeah, it is time travel, but it was basically communication into the past,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? So yeah,
Correct. Yep.
I
And
guess I didn't need to go into that detail, but
no, it's helpful. No, it's helpful. And so let's just go there full tilt into, and this is kind of the last major point we want to make, is that time travel, right? This is time travel
right,
in a presentist universe is not possible. Okay. And so,
Right.
and that's because neither the future nor the past exist. The only thing that exists
Right.
is actually what is happening now, right? What we are
Right.
present right now. And
Right.
so the issue with this is that very many Christian kids' books and television shows, and now there's even Answers in Genesis is actually putting a new attraction in Dollywood, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee area called Truth Traveler. And it has a time travel. My kids right now are in a fantastic Christian school. And one of them is reading a book called Secrets of the Ancient Scrolls, in which you can travel back to Bible times. And you say, well, this is just fiction. It's just, and I get that. Okay. I understand. However, if it's really true, right, that eternalism is false and actually has very dangerous theological implications, then we should actually be very careful about this. I think.
Right. Good point. Because the time travel fiction is steeped in scientific, I say pseudoscience, right? Trappings, right?
Right.
So,
Yes. Yes.
so it's evil. It's evil in,
Yeah.
made presentable with a scientific veneer.
Right. And again, that may be, I mean, again, I am a sci-fi nerd. I mean, I'm now I don't watch Doctor Who. I've actually never watched it, which might get me in trouble with some of you. But I understand that Doctor Who is supposed to be one of the best shows ever if you're a science fiction nerd. There's a sense in which I would love for something like time travel to be possible because I love talking about the idea of time. But the reality is that from an ontological perspective, that is, we're dealing with the real world. Time is the thing that we're moving through right now, right? We are not extended in space in this world. We persist through time as a 3D object. The only time that exists is the present. And that's just the reality of the situation. And so time is actually, the way I would put it is time is a lot more boring than we've made it out to be, right? I don't know if that's
Right. It's not exotic, right?
right.
Like the
It's not very
the
exciting.
four dimensionalism, right? Yeah. We're
Right.
constrained by time, right? So
Well, I think as humans, we're obsessed with exploration. We're obsessed with the unknown. You know, what's out there? What's out there in space? What's out there in the oceans? Right? What's out there? Well, with this eternalist construct, we have two new out theres to explore, right? The past and the future. Those are new zones of exploration for humans. And so whether it's you're trying to go back as a, time traveler to Bible times and experience something that happened in the Bible, or whether you're a futurist and you're trying to look 50 years into the future to see what the
right,
world's going to be like.
right,
Those are exciting because they're unexplored zones. And the reality is, from a Christian, especially ontological perspective, the way we should be looking at it is, well, those zones don't exist for our exploration anyway. So let's just move on and find
correct,
something else to
correct,
talk about.
correct.
So,
Yeah, one other aspect, I guess, is a footnote. We talked about the issue of the saved soul, the person that, at one time we were all lost and then we're saved. So are we a composite of a saved, lost soul? The other aspect with time travel is, let's take Marty going back and seeing himself in the other movie where he sees himself on the stage. So we got two souls there, right?
yeah.
So we got Marty has this Marty there he's in the same now, right? He goes back and sees himself, right?
Yeah.
So at that instance, he's got is it Christian theism is that our identity is we can have two souls,
Oh my goodness. Wow.
right?
Yeah. I mean, that is just
And
huge.
two separate awarenesses, right? Which we would say are attributes of our souls, right? Soul spirits.
Wow. Yeah. That is amazing. And yeah, I feel like we need to stop there because there's just so much. But like, honestly, if you're a Christian, you should at least be really thinking hard about this. Wherever you end up landing, you should be thinking hard about this, and you definitely should not, and we should be careful, right? Like, I'm a stickler about, like, I try not to use the word species if I don't have to when I'm talking about things in evolution. Why? Well, because actually the terminology that you use assumes particular things about the world, about the way that terms are used, right? And so even saying the word space-time, right? You're actually assuming what we've landed on in this podcast episode to be an anti-Christian idea by using the word space-time, even though it's obviously harmless. You didn't mean anything by it, but it has implications.
Right. Yeah. When you utter the word space-time, are you viewing it as an ontological, concrete entity? Or are you viewing space-time as Minkowski's jot diagrams, graphs?
Yeah.
And for Christians, it's the latter.
That's right. All right. Well, Phil, I'll tell you what, we've gone a little over an hour and a half. And so this has been fantastic. I love this. I think this will be very helpful. Maybe one of the most in-depth resources that will be available as a podcast or as a video on YouTube from a Christian theological perspective, and certainly from a creationist perspective on specifically presentism and eternalism. So thank you for your time. Did you have any final thoughts before we go?
Well, yeah, I hope a lot of the sections were very clear. And I know when you get into the math, it's very difficult to try to unravel all the details. And perhaps that could be done in more depth at another time, but specifically. But
all right. Well, this has been fun. We're coming. I think this is the fourth. This is the fourth episode so far that we will have done, and I think we have 2 more planned potentially, and I'm sure that others will come in the future as well. But we're going to be talking about for sure. We're going to go into actually Phil's own not space time. Phil's own distant starlight solution, a consistent relativistic young Earth cosmology. And I'm not sure, potentially before that, we might talk about special relativity and general relativity as its own sort of episode to kind of talk about why a special relativity solution may not be the kind of solution that's needed to actually solve the space-time problem or the distant starlight problem. Now I have myself using the word space-time. So I think that might be where we're headed next, but we'll kind of talk through that and bring you whatever makes the most sense. And without further ado, then, we're going to sign off for now. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Phil.
Looking forward to it.